We're not talking about dusty dates and boring kings. Oh no. We are talking about the moment the lights went out on an entire culture, a moment so violent, so utterly catastrophic, that it created a scream that would echo across 500 years of brutal power plays, religious crusades, and unimaginable plagues. A catastrophe no one saw coming, except maybe the man who was about to lose everything. This single day, October 14th, 1066, was an earthquake, a seismic shift so complete it permanently severed England from its Saxon roots and shackled it to a Norman tyrant named William, a man whose ambition was as cold and relentless as the North Sea itself. This moment of ultimate failure gave rise to a dynasty of conquerors who would bleed the land dry for centuries to come. But the lead up to this apocalypse? It's a thriller worthy of the biggest screen. Imagine a land ruled by two competing giants. Harold, the strongman Earl, who seized the throne through sheer force of will after the death of the childless Edward the Confessor, and the shadowy, manipulative figure of William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed God had promised him the prize. William of Normandy had landed his invasion fleet at Pevensey Bay. He hadn't just arrived, he was burning the southern coastline, laying waste to everything in his path to ensure his forces had no retreat. His landing was not a landing, it was a scorched earth declaration of war, intended to terrify and starve the local population into submission before a single major battle was even fought. Can you grasp the magnitude of this impossible choice? Harold had just marched his army hundreds of miles north, fought a battle that would have crushed any lesser man, and now he had to immediately turn his weary, blood-caked soldiers around and race 250 miles south to face a fresh, merciless, and terrifyingly organized Norman war machine. He could have waited, gathered more levies, rested his troops, but waiting meant letting William solidify his beachhead and potentially march unopposed on London. This wasn't strategy. This was pure desperation fueled by a king's duty. Harold rushed, sacrificing logistics for speed, dragging his tired housecarls, his elite fighting force, down the ancient Roman roads toward Hastings. Every mile was a calculated risk, every hour a theft from his energy reserves, moving closer to the inevitable collision that would decide if the English language, the English law, and the English identity would survive the sunset. When they finally arrived, establishing their famous shield wall atop Senlac Hill, they were facing an army that was not just French, but a multinational legion of hardened mercenaries, driven by the ruthless promise of land and plunder from their duke. William was a genius of brutality. He knew exactly how to dismantle a kingdom, piece by bloody piece, starting with the morale of the defenders. The battle itself was a masterpiece of tactical deception. The ultimate chess game played with human lives. The English shield wall was impenetrable, a terrifying human fortress that repelled wave after wave of Norman cavalry, their axes and spears shattering the expensive lances of the charging horsemen. The shouts, the clang of axe on shield, the raw smell of blood and fear. It was a sensory overload of medieval warfare at its absolute peak. A defense that should have been unbreakable. For hours, the line held. The Normans were beginning to falter, their belief shaken. Some began to flee, convinced they could not break the stubborn Saxon defense, spreading panic in the ranks. It was here, in this moment of near defeat, that William unleashed the trick that would shatter 1,000 years of English history forever, the feigned retreat. Imagine the scene. The Normans turned tail, running down the hill, screaming panic, making it look like a rout. The exhausted, adrenaline-fueled English, thinking they had won the day against impossible odds, broke ranks. They charged down the slope, abandoning the high ground, abandoning their tactical advantage. Lured into the open by the smell of final victory, eager to finish the job. And then the trap snapped shut with the sound of thousands of hooves turning on a dime. The retreating Normans instantly wheeled around, their cavalry crashing into the now exposed, disorganized English infantry, cutting them down in swaths. It was slaughter, pure and immediate. But still, Harold and his elite guard fought on, forming a desperate last stand around their tattered banner, refusing to yield the hill. England was now a conquered land, held by force and cruelty. The next 500 years would be defined by the Norman yoke, a brutal, iron fist of French law, French language, and French tyranny imposed on a broken, resentful population. Can you believe this level of systemic trauma gave birth to the outlaw story of Robin Hood, the legends of Arthur, and eventually the demands for liberty enshrined in the Magna Carta? This seismic shift made the island nation into the crucible of power it would become. This is only the beginning of the darkness. Prepare yourself, because we are about to dive deep into 1,000 years of political maneuvering, dynastic collapse, the rise of terrifying warrior kings, and the catastrophic failures that led to the Black Death wiping out half of Europe. This story is not for the faint of heart. This is how the most powerful, most dangerous island nation on Earth was truly forged in fire and absolute betrayal. Get ready. The stage was set, the betrayal complete. But the performance, the blood-soaked drama of the Norman conquest, was just beginning its opening act. On a cold, wind-swept hill near Hastings, the fate of an entire civilization hung precariously on the razor-sharp edge of a shield wall. King Harold Godwinson, exhausted from marching his hardened housecarls hundreds of miles south after crushing the Norse threat at Stamford Bridge, stood ready. He had faith in that wall, that impenetrable Saxon barrier of linked shields and axes, a defense legendary across Europe, unbreakable by any frontal assault. But William of Normandy did not fight fair. William was not a man of honor. He was a machine of ambition, a genius of strategic cruelty, and he knew exactly how to dismantle the English heart. He brought with him the finest, most merciless cavalry the continent could offer, mounted thunderbolts ready to smash bone and morale. The first assaults failed, just as Harold knew they would. The Norman cavalry charged, recoiled, and broke against the relentless Saxon discipline. William watched his men fail, and in that moment he executed one of the most audacious, gut-wrenching military deceptions ever conceived. The feigned retreat. It sounds simple, but it was psychological warfare designed to unravel the Saxon soul. As the Norman line appeared to break and run, the English, driven by a fury born of patriotism and exhaustion, abandoned their high ground and their iron discipline. They chased the retreating enemy down the slope, leaving the protective cover of their shield wall. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the moment England died. The pursuing Saxons found themselves caught in a devastating trap. William's cavalry, wheeled back with terrifying speed, slammed into the scattered, exposed English formations. It was no longer a battle, it was a butchery. The systematic slaughter of a proud people caught flat-footed by a lie. The shield wall was broken, the leader annihilated, and the fate of the nation sealed in blood and mud. The year 1066 was over, but the conquest had only just begun. What followed was not a gentle transition. It was the Norman yoke, a period of systemic, cultural, and political genocide so thorough, England became a foreign colony in its own land. Overnight, the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy, the proud ealdormen and thegns who had ruled for generations, were stripped of everything. Their lands, their titles, their very language, all deemed worthless. William parceled out the entire kingdom to his loyal, merciless barons, turning vast swaths of England into French-speaking feudal domains. If you were English, you were now a peasant, a serf, a slave, bound to the land you once owned. The language of power, of the court, of the law, and even of God was now French. English became the gutter tongue, the language of the stable and the field, forced underground for centuries, only surviving in the mouths of the conquered. The resistance, however, was fierce, especially in the cold, unforgiving north. The Anglo-Saxons refused to bow, launching furious, desperate revolts centered around the ancient city of York. But William's response to dissent was not diplomacy. It was unimaginable horror. He unleashed the harrying of the North. This was not war. It was state-sponsored mass murder designed to erase the very memory of rebellion. William's forces marched through Yorkshire and Northumberland, systematically destroying every village, every farm, every store of grain. It was scorched earth on an apocalyptic scale. The region remained scarred and desolate for decades, a permanent, terrifying warning written in famine and ash. Defy William, and your civilization will be wiped from the map. But William was not just a military dictator. He was a bureaucrat of absolute control. To truly own England, he had to know every blade of grass, every pig, every peasant, and every ounce of wealth he had stolen. So, in 1085, he commissioned a monstrous record-keeping project. The Domesday Book. This was the ultimate tool of oppression. It was a comprehensive census, a detailed inventory of every single piece of property, every landholder, every tenant, every tax owed in the entire kingdom. It was so terrifyingly complete, so utterly final in its judgment of ownership, that people believed it rivaled the biblical Book of Judgment, Domesday, the Day of Accounting. For the conquered English, this book confirmed the finality of their subjugation. Not only had William taken their land by the sword, but he had written his ownership in ink, creating an undeniable, indelible legal record that cemented the foundation of the centralized, powerful English state. The iron grip of the Normans was secured, and the stage was set for the next century of brutal dynastic power struggles, treachery, and the creation of an empire forged in the fires of 1066. Get ready for the chaos that followed. The dust of Hastings had settled, soaking the earth in the blood of the Old World, but the nightmare for the Anglo-Saxons was only just beginning. William, now known forever as the Conqueror, did not simply inherit a crown. He seized a prize and immediately began the systematic, ruthless dismantling of everything England had been for centuries. The coronation on Christmas Day 1066 was a moment of supreme, almost sickening irony, a religious facade hiding the steel fist that was about to crush the native population under the unforgiving weight of the Norman yoke. The brutal reality was that this was a hostile military occupation, enforced by men who spoke a foreign tongue, French, and viewed the surviving English inhabitants as little more than potential rebels or livestock to be managed and taxed. Every single major political, religious, and economic institution was instantly purged of its Saxon leadership, replaced by French-speaking barons, Norman bishops, and foreign sheriffs who owed their entire existence, their very breath, to the Duke of Normandy. Resistance wasn't just met with traditional military force. It was met with a campaign of absolute, soul-destroying annihilation designed to break the spirit of an entire nation and ensure that they would never, ever rise again to challenge the new order. The fate of the English was sealed not just in battle, but in the calculated cruelty that followed the victory. This was the infamous harrying of the North, a cleansing, genocidal fire that extinguished life across vast swaths of ancient Yorkshire and Northumberland. William marched through the brutal northern winter, systematically burning every last crop, slaughtering all usable livestock, and leveling villages, turning over 100 miles of previously fertile land into a desolate, starvation-ridden wasteland. Contemporary chroniclers lamented that the landscape remained barren and unused for decades. People were driven to unimaginable acts, even cannibalism, just to survive the engineered starvation. This wasn't traditional warfare. It was an act of calculated, systemic state terrorism designed to secure the crown through the most absolute, crippling fear imaginable. To prevent even the slightest flicker of resistance from ever igniting again, William immediately constructed the ultimate network of intimidation across his newly conquered realm, the Norman castle. These weren't the romantic stone fortresses we often picture today. They started as menacing, temporary Motte and Bailey structures, quickly thrown up wooden towers perched precariously on high earth mounds, always strategically placed overlooking the conquered Anglo-Saxon towns and vital infrastructure. Each hastily constructed castle was a permanent, visible dagger pointed directly at the throat of the local populace, garrisoned by foreign, heavily armed knights ready to enforce the Duke's laws with swift and crushing efficiency. London itself received the ultimate, inescapable symbol of Norman dominance, the formidable White Tower, the initial and terrifying structure of what would become the Tower of London, a massive, aggressive statement of military power, visible for miles around. Simultaneously, William solidified the imported continental feudal system, a rigid, unbreakable hierarchical structure where all land, and thus all power, ultimately belonged to the king alone. Land was granted to Norman barons, the tenants-in-chief, in exchange for solemn oaths of absolute loyalty and mandatory military service. A sophisticated, brutal chain of command built entirely on obligation and total subservience to the crown. But the conqueror knew that true, enduring power wasn't just held by the sword, it was held by absolute, detailed information. In 1085, William commissioned one of the most astonishing, audacious documents in European history, the Doomsday Book. This was no friendly census. It was the ultimate act of state surveillance and comprehensive financial accounting, a massive survey detailing who owned what, how much it was worth before the conquest, and precisely how much it was worth now under Norman rule. Royal commissioners fanned out across the entire country, interrogating every man, woman, and livestock owner, meticulously recording every piece of property, every head of livestock, and every single taxable asset. The subjugated English people named it the Domesday Book because its judgment, like God's on the final day of reckoning, was final, inescapable, and utterly unchangeable. The purpose was crystal clear: to establish an iron grip on taxation and land ownership, ensuring that William could squeeze every last penny out of his new domain, and prevent any future ambiguities that might ever dare to challenge his legal right to absolute control. He now possessed the single most detailed map of wealth and power in the entire Western world, solidifying his tyrannical hold. A truly fitting, shocking end for the man who had brought such bloody, permanent transformation to England. But his death did not bring peace. It immediately unleashed the first major dynastic crisis of the new Norman realm. William had 3 surviving ambitious sons: Robert Curthose, who inherited Normandy, William Rufus, who seized England, and Henry, who got only cash. The unity forged in blood and conquest was instantly splintered by fierce, jealous sibling rivalry. William Rufus, now King William II, was a brutal, flamboyant, and deeply unpopular ruler, often described by chroniclers as a cruel, avaricious tyrant who cared only for extravagant hunting, endless money, and relentless war. His reign was a constant tightrope walk against plots, rebellions, and the ever-present threat of his elder brother Robert trying to reclaim the English throne by force. This deep internal strife, driven by lust for power and the unstable foundations of a recently conquered land, ensured that the brief Norman peace was always a terrifying mirage. England was not done suffering. It was merely transitioning from the brutal conquest phase into the equally brutal phase of internal dynastic power grabs, setting the stage for decades of treacherous betrayals and shocking, violent deaths that would rock the foundations of the realm, leading us inevitably toward the terrifying anarchy that was just around the corner. Get ready, because the Norman dynasty was about to eat itself alive. The conqueror had won the crown, but that was just the appetizer. The real meal was the complete, utter subjugation of a proud people. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, those who hadn't fallen at Hastings, were systematically hunted down, stripped of every scrap of land, and replaced by William's ruthless French-speaking cronies. This wasn't just a change of king. It was a cultural extermination at the top. The language of power shifted overnight to Old French, the laws changed, and the very soul of England was put under foreign management, locked in a chokehold of chainmail and stone. But the North, stubborn and fierce, dared to defy him. They burned his sheriffs, they raised the old standards, they screamed the name of the true Saxon heir, Edgar the Atheling. William's response? A level of systematic destruction that still chills historians to their core, an act known simply as the harrying of the North. It was not a battle. It was a scorched earth policy designed to inflict maximum generational pain. For years afterward, chroniclers wrote of starving refugees, cannibalism, and tens of thousands dying of famine because there was simply nothing left to eat. The scale of the carnage was apocalyptic, leaving a wasteland so profound that parts of it were still recorded as unusable decades later in the Domesday Book. William had made his point. Resistance was not just futile, it meant oblivion. To ensure this level of control was permanent, William built the engine of repression, the castle. These were not the picturesque ruins we see today. They were raw, brutal instruments of domination, motte and bailey defenses that sprang up everywhere like malignant stone mushrooms. Every hill, every river crossing, every strategic point was crowned by a timber tower sitting on a man-made mound, projecting Norman power far beyond the reach of a single army. This was the era where the great English landscape was literally reshaped, forced to bend to the will of the conqueror's architects of fear. And beneath these intimidating stone sentinels, the entire fabric of society was brutally reorganized through the infamous feudal system. Land, the source of all power, now belonged entirely to William, who was the ultimate landlord. He leased it out to his most loyal barons, tenants-in-chief, in exchange for military service and loyalty. These barons, in turn, rented it to knights, who rented it to serfs. Everyone owed obedience upward, creating an unbreakable chain of command, where the king's authority was absolute and terrifyingly efficient. The Anglo-Saxon system of law and local governance was shattered and replaced by a highly centralized, militaristic hierarchy. But perhaps the most terrifying act of centralization came in 1086, the Doomsday Book. William needed to know exactly what he owned, who owned what, and how much tax he could squeeze from his ravaged kingdom. So he dispatched commissioners across England with one simple, terrifying instruction: record every manor, every pig, every acre of woodland, every mill, every freeman, every serf. It was the most comprehensive survey of land and population Europe had ever seen, a bureaucratic masterpiece of tyranny. The common people called it the Doomsday Book because its judgments were final and inescapable, just like the judgments on Judgment Day itself. It was proof that the Norman grip was total, reaching into the smallest details of every peasant's life. It codified the conquest, turning the violence of 1066 into permanent, legally binding economic servitude. William had achieved total historical domination. His death immediately threw his newly forged realm into utter chaos. He split his inheritance. Normandy went to his eldest son, Robert Curthose, and England went to his second son, William Rufus, William II, a man known for his fiery temper, bright red hair, and total lack of diplomacy. Instantly, the great Norman barons, who held lands on both sides of the Channel, faced an impossible choice. They hated the division. How could they serve two masters? Loyalty became a commodity, and rebellion became a pastime. Henry Bolingbroke, the youngest son, immediately rode to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and declared himself King Henry I. The Norman dynasty was already cannibalizing itself, setting the stage for decades of deadly sibling rivalry. Henry I, a sophisticated but ruthless politician, secured his claim by marrying Matilda of Scotland, linking the new dynasty back to the old Anglo-Saxon royal line, a brilliant PR move. He was known as the Lion of Justice, but his justice was swift and often bloody. He brought a temporary iron fist of stability. But stability in the 12th century was a mirage. When Henry I lost his only legitimate son, William Adelin, in the catastrophic sinking of the White Ship in 1120, the entire future of the kingdom was thrown into jeopardy. That single disaster, that horrifying loss of the heir, opened the door to a generational nightmare. Henry forced his barons to swear allegiance to his daughter Matilda, but the moment the old king closed his eyes for the last time, the lords broke their oaths like dry twigs. The stage was set. The cousin, Stephen of Blois, seized the throne, defying Matilda's claim. Two claimants, two armies, and a nation about to descend into 18 years of unrelenting, lawless horror. Get ready for the anarchy. The drumbeat of Henry I's passing wasn't a signal for mourning, it was the starting gun for a national cannibalization. When Stephen of Blois, seizing his chance like a predator, snatched the crown, he didn't just break an oath to Matilda, he shattered the fragile concept of centralized royal authority that the Normans had so ruthlessly built over the last 70 years. What followed was not a traditional war, but a localized, endless series of brutal skirmishes, where every minor lord with 2 swords and a leaky fortification suddenly decided he was entitled to carve out his own miniature kingdom of terror. The royal currency became worthless, law courts shut down, and the king's peace evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the crushing weight of baronial ego. The chroniclers, the only real witnesses to this hell, wrote in horror about the castles that sprung up like toxic fungi across the land, unauthorized fortresses called adulterine castles, where the rule was simple: torture and extortion. They dragged men, women, and priests into these stone dungeons, demanding impossible ransoms, using chains so heavy they broke bones, and inventing methods of agony that defied human comprehension, like hanging victims by their thumbs or stuffing them into chests filled with sharp stones. The land was so plundered, the famous line goes, that if 2 or 3 horsemen arrived at a village, all the inhabitants fled, believing them to be robbers, for indeed they often were. Stephen, though personally a brave and affable man, was disastrously ill-suited for this level of systematic treachery. His weakness was his inability to say no to anyone, constantly granting favors and land to buy loyalty, thereby depleting the very wealth he needed to fight the war. While he was busy trying to placate a constantly shifting network of greedy barons, Matilda, the formidable empress, trained in the cutthroat politics of the Holy Roman Empire, was preparing her vengeance, backed by the single most powerful man in England, her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester. Robert was Matilda's shield, her sword, and her political mastermind. And when she finally invaded in 1139, the war went from low-grade chaos to an organized 2-front slaughter. 4 years into the chaos, in 1141, the war reached its shocking zenith at the Battle of Lincoln. Stephen, cornered and outnumbered, fought with the desperate ferocity of a trapped lion, his axe swinging in deadly arcs, refusing to yield even as his entire retinue collapsed around him. He was eventually overwhelmed, pulled down, captured, and taken in chains to Bristol. Imagine the scene. A crowned, anointed king of England, dragged through the mud, a prisoner of his own cousin. The capture of Stephen was supposed to be the end. The Londoners, famously volatile, revolted within weeks. They chased her out of the city in a desperate rout, forcing her to flee the capital just as her coronation robes were being stitched. It was the shortest, most spectacular failure in the history of English queenship. The war instantly reversed. Robert of Gloucester, her mighty general, was captured shortly thereafter during the rout of Winchester. The political gears ground to a halt. The only solution was a massive, unprecedented prisoner exchange: King Stephen for the Earl of Gloucester. The Siege of Oxford in 1142 became legendary. Stephen cornered Matilda inside the castle during the bitter depths of winter. Facing certain capture, Matilda executed an escape worthy of cinematic legend.
cloaked entirely in white to blend with the fresh snow covering the frozen River Thames. She slipped out of the castle gates under the cover of night, crossing the treacherous ice on foot while the enemy guards searched every dark corner of the fortress walls. She survived, but her cause seemed lost, reduced to small holdings in the West Country, waiting for a miracle. That miracle arrived in the form of her son, Henry Fitz-Empress.
This boy, the future Henry II, the founder of the terrifying Plantagenet dynasty, was not just ambitious. He was a political and military prodigy. As a young man, he began to make increasingly aggressive forays into England, demonstrating a terrifying command over men and strategy that his mother never possessed. By 1153, the war-weary barons, the church, and the entire exhausted nation realized the chaos had to end. They could not endure another generation of anarchy. The final confrontation came near Wallingford, where the armies of Stephen and young Henry faced each other across the Thames. But no one wanted to fight. The soldiers, broken by 18 years of civil strife, refused to charge. The barons demanded peace. In a twist of fate often cited as divine intervention, Stephen's own son and heir, Eustace, died suddenly shortly thereafter, removing the last political obstacle to peace. Stephen, broken by grief and exhausted by war, finally agreed to the Treaty of Wallingford later that year. The terms were simple and brutal. Stephen would remain king until his natural death, but the young, terrifyingly capable Henry Fitz-Empress would immediately be recognized as his successor. The curtain closed on the anarchy, but it opened on something far larger, far more ruthless, the dawn of the Angevin Empire. When Stephen died barely a year later, the throne passed to a fiery, red-headed 21-year-old who would rule the greatest domain Europe had ever seen, stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. Get ready for Henry II, the most dangerous king in English history. Henry II, the new master of England, did not just rule an island. He mastered a colossal geopolitical entity known to history as the Angevin Empire. Stretching from the Scottish borders down through Wales, across Normandy, Anjou, Maine, and all the way to Aquitaine near the Pyrenees, this domain made Henry the most powerful sovereign in Western Europe, eclipsing the feeble King of France. When he ascended the throne in 1154, the chaos of the preceding civil war, the anarchy, vanished overnight. Henry was a living storm, a red-haired, restless whirlwind of energy who read constantly, spoke 5 languages, and never sat still, traveling tirelessly across his vast lands to assert his absolute, terrifying authority. He possessed a genius for organization unmatched by any ruler since the Romans, instantly recognizing that the key to lasting power lay not just in military might, but in legal control. While other kings were busy swinging swords, Henry was busy writing laws. He didn't just rebuild castles, he systematically rebuilt the entire legal infrastructure of England, laying the foundation for what we still call common law. He introduced crucial concepts that standardized justice, trial by jury, the formalization of judicial writs, and the terrifying circuit courts, justices in ire, that brought the king's justice directly to every local village, shattering the old system where local lords dispensed arbitrary violence. The Assize of Clarendon in 1166 standardized procedures for criminal indictment. If you committed a serious crime, you no longer faced the whims of a local baron. You faced the ruthless, impartial, centralized machinery of the crown. This was the true engine of the Angevin Empire, law, codified and enforced with relentless efficiency. But even a ruler as absolute as Henry had a rival power structure he needed to crush: the Church. The Church was a state within a state, demanding its own courts, benefit of clergy, and refusing to allow the king to tax its immense wealth. This conflict required a surgical strike, and Henry believed he had the perfect weapon: his best friend, Thomas Becket. Becket, Henry's chancellor, was the king's ultimate fixer. A flamboyant, brilliant, secular politician who threw the most scandalous, extravagant parties in England and knew all of Henry's secrets. They were inseparable, two halves of a terrifying political mind. When the Archbishop of Canterbury died, Henry saw his chance. If he could elevate his loyal friend to the highest ecclesiastical office, he would control the Church absolutely. So, in 1162, Henry forced Becket's promotion to archbishop. It was supposed to be a done deal, a masterstroke of political manipulation. But the moment the sacred oil touched Becket's brow, something horrifying happened. The secular playboy underwent an instantaneous, terrifying spiritual transformation. Becket traded his luxurious silk robes for a rough, bristly hair shirt crawling with vermin, started fasting religiously, and became the most zealous, uncompromising defender of the Church's rights England had ever produced. He went from being Henry's tool to Henry's ultimate nightmare, a defiant martyr waiting for his stage. The conflict centered immediately on the Constitutions of Clarendon, 1164, Henry's attempt to subject criminous clerks, priests who committed crimes, even murder or rape, to the king's secular courts. Becket refused, screaming that Henry was attempting to lay impious hands on God's chosen servants. The fury between the two former friends became legendary. Henry, used to instant, absolute obedience, tried to crush Becket financially and politically, forcing the archbishop to flee England and live in exile on the continent for 6 years, protected by the Pope and Henry's great enemy, King Louis VII of France. This was not policy. This was a venomous, personal feud tearing the kingdom apart. A shaky reconciliation was finally arranged in 1170, allowing Becket to return. But Becket returned not in peace, but as a righteous revolutionary. He immediately started excommunicating the bishops who had dared to side with Henry, effectively restarting the war before he had even unpacked his relics. When news reached Henry, who was campaigning in Normandy, the king exploded in one of his famous, terrifying rages. He reportedly tore off his clothes, chewed the straw on the floor, and screamed a desperate, damning question into the court: "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" 4 ambitious knights, Reginald Fitzurus, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, heard the king's anguished cry not as a rhetorical question, but as a direct, lethal command. They immediately saddled up, crossed the channel in a terrifying, deadly rush, and rode straight for Canterbury Cathedral. Henry II was politically ruined, forced into years of penance, culminating in a humiliating public scourging by monks while walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury. It was the price of power, and it showed the entire world that even the genius who built the Angevin Empire could not defeat the power of the Church. The stain of Becket's blood would cling to the Plantagenet dynasty for centuries. Get ready, because the ultimate betrayal is coming next. Henry's own sons, trained by him to be dangerous, are about to rise against their father in a brutal civil war that will nearly shatter the empire he built. The air crackled with a tension thicker than the stone walls of Chinon Castle itself. Henry II, the architect of the Angevin Empire, the man whose rage could scorch continents, stood paralyzed, not by foreign invasion, but by a wound dealt from within, the treachery of his own kin. They were the progeny of ambition and fury, trained by him to be wolves, and now they hunted the alpha. The Great Revolt of 1173 was not a political disagreement. It was a psychological massacre, a family melodrama played out on the battlefields of Europe. Young Henry, known as the Young King, the heir apparent who was crowned but given no real authority, was the figurehead of the rebellion. He craved the actual power his father wielded, not just the gilded title of a powerless puppet. He demanded immediate control over Normandy or Anjou, territories that Henry II would sooner surrender to a foreign foe than to his own overambitious son. His refusal ignited the powder keg. She urged Richard, the warlord already, and Geoffrey, the cunning diplomat, to join the cause, transforming a simple dispute over land grants into a full-scale pan-European civil war that threatened the very foundations of Henry's power structure. This alliance was a dagger plunged straight into the heart of the Plantagenet domain, a coalition of resentment stretching from Edinburgh to Paris, united solely by their desire to see the mighty Henry II fall and his empire shatter into a million pieces. Henry II, however, was not one to crumble easily. His wrath was legendary, a force of nature that terrified even his hardened soldiers. But his strategic mind was unmatched. He immediately mobilized his vast network of mercenaries, the ruthless Brabançon soldiers, paid for by the deep pockets of the English treasury. He prepared to crush the revolt with a speed and savagery only he possessed, gathering his loyal barons and reminding them that their titles and lands were derived entirely from his continued reign, making their loyalty an act of self-preservation. He knew the stakes instantly. If his sons succeeded, the Angevin Empire, the sprawling domain stretching from the Solway Firth to the Pyrenees, would dissolve into 1,000 warring fragments, ending the dream of Plantagenet supremacy forever. This war was existential, a battle for his throne, his legacy, and his very soul. He moved like a storm front, crossing the Channel with blinding speed, securing his English holdings first, knowing that England was the economic bedrock sustaining the entire immense imperial edifice. He needed swift, decisive victories to shatter the morale of the young rebels and demonstrate that the old lion still possessed claws sharper and deadlier than his cubs. But even the mighty Henry recognized the power of superstition and public perception in a deeply religious age. In a stroke of brilliant political theater, or perhaps genuine terrified repentance, he made a sudden shocking pilgrimage to the tomb of his long-dead rival, Thomas Becket. This was the archbishop he had inadvertently murdered years earlier, a sin that had haunted his reign and threatened his divine mandate. In a scene of astonishing, calculated humility, the greatest ruler in Europe walked barefoot through the muddy, crowded streets of Canterbury.
This calculated humiliation worked instantly, shattering the political narrative against him. Moments after he completed his bloody penance, news arrived that felt less like coincidence and more like an act of divine intervention. William the Lion of Scotland, the key military ally of the rebels, had been captured in a crucial skirmish at Alnwick.
Coincidences? Fate? Henry believed it was divine vindication, a clear sign that heaven approved of his penance and now supported his crushing of the internal enemies. Armed with this moral and strategic victory, Henry turned his terrifying focus back toward France. The Great Revolt collapsed under the weight of his ruthless efficiency and overwhelming force. The young king was isolated and defeated. Richard was cornered in Aquitaine, and Geoffrey was forced to beg for mercy at his father's feet, the rebellion sputtering out into a humiliating failure. Henry was victorious, the empire saved, but the cost was devastating. He spared his sons, for now, believing he could control them, but the wounds were permanent, the familial trust annihilated forever. The ultimate price, however, fell upon the true instigator, Eleanor of Aquitaine. Henry had her arrested, treating her not as a queen or a wife, but as a dangerous, high-value political prisoner who could never again be allowed to roam free. For the next 15 years, the most powerful woman in Europe would languish in captivity, shifting between various castles, a caged lioness simmering with unimaginable vengeance, her absence creating a massive power vacuum in Aquitaine and fueling Richard's growing ambition. The peace was a lie, a thin veneer stretched over generations of hatred. The young king, unsatisfied and restless, continued to plot until his sudden, agonizing death from dysentery in 1183 while campaigning in Limousin. His demise was brutal and dramatic, a cautionary tale about defying the patriarchy. But his death only elevated the next son, Richard. Now the undisputed heir, Richard was a force of nature, a brilliant, ruthless general whose reputation for martial prowess was already spreading like wildfire across the continent, overshadowing his father's reputation. He was everything Henry II had dreamed of creating, and everything he now feared, knowing that his successor was a genuine military genius. Henry tried desperately to elevate his youngest and most favored son, John, the future Lackland, carving out territories for him in Ireland and Aquitaine. This move was an immediate, calculated insult that instantly infuriated Richard, the rightful heir, and gave him the perfect pretext for the final, devastating act of betrayal. The desert sands of the Holy Land had become a furnace, forging Richard Coeur de Lion into a legend, yet simultaneously grinding his grand ambitions into dust. He had fought the mythic Saladin to a standstill, securing jaw-dropping victories at Acre and Arsuf, proving himself the undisputed military genius of the age. But the true prize, the golden city of Jerusalem, remained maddeningly out of reach, protected not just by Saracen steel, but by the crippling heat, dwindling supplies, and the relentless, poisonous jealousy of his supposed allies. Chief among the betrayers was Philip II Augustus, the King of France, who had feigned loyalty long enough to solidify his own position before abandoning the crusade entirely, slinking back to Paris like a viper to prepare his ambush. Philip knew that the colossal Angevin Empire was built on the shifting sands of absentee rulership, and he could wait. Richard, knowing the political knives were being sharpened back in England, had no choice but to broker a shaky truce with Saladin, a truce that felt more like a concession of defeat than a victory, securing only coastal strongholds for pilgrims rather than the holy city itself. The journey back was a desperate, clandestine flight. He knew the ports of France were closed to him, guarded by Philip's spies, and his only route was through the treacherous heart of Central Europe, where old scores were waiting to be settled. Richard attempted to travel disguised as a simple pilgrim, navigating the lands where his reputation was both his shield and his greatest vulnerability. The moment he stepped onto the lands of Austria, specifically near Vienna, fate, or rather the simmering, vengeful hatred of Duke Leopold V, snapped the trap shut. Leopold had never forgiven Richard for the insults and disrespect hurled during the siege of Acre, when Richard had purportedly thrown Leopold's banner from the walls, and now he held the King of England captive, the greatest prize in Christendom. The news hit England like a plague, traveling instantly across the continent. The Lionheart was caged. The ransom demanded was astronomical, a sum designed not just to enrich his captors, but to utterly bleed the English crown dry. 100,000 marks of silver were demanded for his release from Leopold, a figure equivalent to the annual income of the entire kingdom, plus 50,000 more for his temporary overlord, the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI. This was the ultimate squeeze. While loyal subjects bled themselves dry, melting down church plate, demanding draconian taxes, and even the king's gold and silver personal possessions were being liquidated, Richard's slimy younger brother, John, saw his chance. John Lackland, a man whose ambition vastly outstripped his competence, immediately allied himself with Philip II, offering the French king vast swaths of Normandy and the critical Vexin region in exchange for Philip's help in seizing the English throne, while Richard rotted in a German dungeon. This was treason of the highest order, a dynastic stab in the back that threatened to dismantle the Angevin structure entirely before the century was out. But John underestimated the sheer loyalty Richard commanded among the English barons, and he critically underestimated the steely political resolve of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the Queen Mother, the true strategic genius of the family, who was simultaneously raising the king's ransom and thwarting John's pathetic coup attempts from within. In 1194, after 2 grueling years of captivity, the legendary Lionheart was finally freed. He returned to England not to rest or recuperate, but to unleash pure, righteous fury upon his treacherous brother and his French puppet master. John, caught red-handed, groveled and begged forgiveness, utterly exposed and without allies. In a stunning display of incredible and perhaps foolish magnanimity, Richard forgave him, allegedly remarking, "I hope I shall forget your offenses as easily as you will forget my pardon." This pardon would prove to be one of the most consequential mistakes in English history, sparing the viper who would ultimately destroy his father's empire. Richard's remaining years were immediately consumed by a relentless, punishing war machine aimed solely at crushing Philip II and recovering the lands stolen during his imprisonment. This was less a geopolitical conflict and more a bloody, personal feud for survival between 2 brilliant, if utterly ruthless monarchs. Richard spent nearly every day of his last 5 years on the continent, fighting tooth and nail for every castle, draining the wealth of England to maintain his dominance in France. To combat the relentless sieges and skirmishes imposed by the ever-opportunistic Philip, Richard poured massive resources into constructing a fortress that symbolized his defiance, Château Gaillard, the saucy castle, a revolutionary piece of military architecture overlooking the River Seine. This castle was designed to be unconquerable, a layered masterpiece of concentric defense intended to permanently choke off Philip's advance into Normandy and stand as the ultimate monument to Angevin power. Richard boasted he could hold it even if its walls were made of butter. It was a defensive masterpiece, but Richard's fate was sealed not by a grand battle or the fall of a mighty fortress, but by a petty skirmish over a cache of insignificant treasure, a rumored hoard of Roman gold found by a local peasant. He bequeathed his vast, unstable empire to the one man entirely unfit to rule it, the universally distrusted, deeply incompetent, and eternally unlucky King John. The stage was set for the ultimate reckoning, the collapse of the mighty Angevin dream. The crown had been placed upon a fool, a man whose cowardice was only outmatched by his cruelty. John, known even in his own time as Lackland before he inherited the throne, was now the ultimate inheritor. Yet he lacked the single most vital ingredient of kingship: respect. He was plagued by the ghosts of his magnificent predecessors. His brother, the Lionheart, bled England dry for crusades and ransoms, but died a hero. John would bleed it dry and die a zero. John, meanwhile, was earning his historic nickname Soft Sword by his actions, or rather his lack thereof. While Philip II moved with the terrifying efficiency of a medieval military genius, capturing castles like Château Gaillard, the very fortress Richard the Lionheart had boasted could withstand an attack for a year, John was reportedly lingering in his bedchamber, eating lavish meals, refusing to march to the defense of his own duchy. He was paralyzed by suspicion and self-interest. The resulting disaster of 1204 was not a simple defeat. It was an abandonment of monumental historical consequence. Normandy, the ancestral homeland, the very source of the Norman conquest that defined England, was lost. Gone. It evaporated into the grasping hands of the French crown, instantly severing the centuries-old ties between the English nobility and their continental roots. This military humiliation signaled the absolute end of the first great Anglo-French union, forcing every English noble to make a terrible choice: remain in England and commit fully to the island, or forfeit their estates and allegiance to France. John had just guaranteed that they would never look kindly upon his rule again. Humiliation on the battlefield was swiftly followed by divine condemnation. John dared to defy the mightiest pope in history, Innocent III, a figure whose spiritual and political authority stretched across the entire continent, over the petty squabble of appointing the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. John's arrogance was breathtaking, his political calculus non-existent, believing he could defy heaven itself. No masses, no baptisms, no church weddings, no last rites. England was a land damned by God, the spiritual life of the populace extinguished by royal defiance. For 6 long, agonizing years, the people genuinely believed their souls were forfeit, caught in the crossfire of a petty, doomed king and an uncompromising pontiff. John merely saw an opportunity to plunder the immense wealth of the church, seizing lands and assets to fuel his own bottomless coffers. To fund his disastrous attempts to reclaim his lost French lands, especially the massive, crushing failure at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, which cemented Philip's power and shattered John's credibility forever, John invented new and unprecedented methods of economic extortion. Scutage, a payment made by knights instead of military service, was hiked to utterly unbearable levels, demanded 10 times in 16 years. The baronial patience, already thin as parchment, finally snapped. These were the descendants of the men who had carved up England with William the Conqueror, and now their ancient rights, their inherited lands, and their very lives were held hostage by a paranoid, failing king who had lost half the empire. They demanded ancient liberties, a return to a time when kings, however strong, acknowledged the fundamental boundaries of feudal custom and law. The barons formed a league, a terrifying army marching under the banner of open rebellion, seizing the ultimate prize, London itself, in 1215. This was not a minor protest. This was the total and spectacular breakdown of royal authority across the entire island. John, cornered, defeated militarily, financially, and spiritually, had nowhere left to run. On a desolate, marshy meadow beside the Thames called Runnymede, in June 1215, the king met his fate in a scene of profound humiliation. He was forced by force of arms to affix his great seal to the document they had written, a charter that was not a concession but an absolute, non-negotiable demand for reform. This was the exact moment the absolute power of the monarch, supposedly derived from divine right and conquest, finally hit a brick wall built of baronial steel, collective pride, and the ancient law of the land. The document was the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. Its immediate purpose was pragmatic and narrow: to protect the wealthy elite from an abusive tyrant who could seize their estates without cause. But its philosophical impact was immediate and eternal. Even the king is fundamentally subject to the law. Clause 39 declared with ringing clarity that no free man should be imprisoned, exiled, or dispossessed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, a promise that would echo through history for 1,000 years. Yet, King John had no intention of honoring a single solitary word. He immediately appealed to his powerful ally, the Pope, receiving swift absolution and a furious declaration that the entire charter was null and void, having been signed under duress. The ink was barely dry on the parchment before civil war, the First Barons' War, ignited across England, plunging the land back into utter savage chaos. The collapse was complete. The Angevin Empire was shattered, the church was hostile, the nobles were in arms, and the king was a broken, paranoid shell, desperately fighting for survival. The ultimate reckoning had arrived. The year is 1215, and the walls were closing in on the most hated king in England's brutal history. John Lackland, the man who lost Normandy and defied the Pope, now faced a threat more immediate and terrifying than any foreign invasion: the wrath of his own people, or rather, the wrath of his own barons. They were tired of his arbitrary taxes, his cruel justice, and his utter contempt for the feudal contract that underpinned the entire kingdom. This was not a few disgruntled lords. This was a unified, heavily armed, and politically savvy rebellion. They had demanded the ancient rights and liberties they believed John had systematically crushed.
When John delayed, dodged, and tried to bribe his way out of the crisis, the barons made their move, launching the true siege of the monarchy. Their target was the heart of the kingdom, the ultimate prize, London itself. On May 17, 1215, the rebellious forces swept into the city, not through bloody siege, but because the sympathetic citizens threw open the gates to them. This single act of betrayal, the surrender of the capital, was the seismic shift that broke John's will to resist. He was now a king without his greatest treasury, without his largest stronghold, trapped in Windsor Castle, staring at the abyss. The stage was set for the showdown at Runnymede, a marshy field beside the Thames. This was no polite negotiation. It was a forced surrender conducted at sword point. John arrived, surrounded by his few remaining loyalists, facing an army of furious nobles who held all the cards, including his capital city. The air was thick with mistrust, the silent threat of civil war hanging over every word spoken. And then came the document, written in hurried Latin, forced upon the parchment, the Great Charter, the Magna Carta. For centuries, we remember this as the foundation of freedom, but in that moment it was a list of demands, a legal cage built specifically to shackle a tyrant. It guaranteed things like due process and limited royal power, but its immediate purpose was to ensure that John could never again act above the law, never again fleece his vassals at will. On June 15, 1215, John Lackland, King of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Aquitaine, put his seal to the document. It was the most profound humiliation suffered by an English monarch since the conquest. He signed, but his signature was a lie. His face, they say, was white with fury, his mind already churning with betrayal. He had yielded only to buy time, to gather his strength, and to summon a power far greater than the combined armies of his barons. As soon as the ink was dry, the peace shattered. John immediately appealed to his ultimate ally, the Pope. Pope Innocent III, who had only recently reconciled with John after the interdict, was outraged that mere barons dared to dictate terms to a consecrated king. The Pope declared the Magna Carta null and void, describing it as shameful and demeaning, tearing up the document's authority with a single papal bull. Castles were besieged, lands were ravaged, and the fight for the soul of the kingdom began in earnest. In a moment of pure desperation, recognizing that they could not defeat John and his papal-backed army alone, the barons committed the unthinkable. They offered the crown of England to an enemy prince. They invited Prince Louis of France, the son of King Philip Augustus and the man who currently held the territory John had lost, to cross the Channel and depose the reigning King of England. The arrival of Prince Louis was not merely an invasion, it was an existential crisis for the English identity forged over the previous century. In 1216, Louis landed in Kent and marched toward London, greeted as a liberator by the very men who were supposed to defend the realm against the French crown. He entered London, received the fealty of the rebellious lords, and was proclaimed, though never officially crowned, King of England. John was now truly finished. Hunted across his own kingdom by French forces in the south and rebellious English lords in the north, he spent his final months marching ruthlessly, trying to outmaneuver the invaders, burning and pillaging the lands of his enemies in a last savage display of tyranny. But fate, the ultimate executioner, was already closing in. While crossing the treacherous tidal flats of the Wash in eastern England, disaster struck. The king's baggage train, carrying his royal treasury, the crown jewels, and essential documents, the entire financial backbone of his war effort, was swallowed whole by the rapidly incoming tide. Lost to the mud and the sea, the treasure vanished forever, a poetic, watery end to his catastrophic reign.